If you're interested in making a detailed platformer just like this one, within Gamemaker, using drag and drop, then keep watching.
G'day gamers, and welcome back to our drag and drop platformer series. When I first started this series, I mentioned I would show you how to do one-way platforms in drag and drop. Now the reason I've taken so long to get to that tutorial is because it's quite difficult in drag and drop. But this episode is going to be my final in the series, and I wanted to show you how to do it. So it is a little bit complicated, but it's still something that I wanted to show you how to do. Now the last time I opened this project was before Gamemaker 2.3 was released. And upon opening it, I've noticed that the conversion process that Gamemaker applies to the projects has not correctly set it up for 2.3. So I'm just going to quickly show you what you need to do in case that happens to you. So firstly, up here, I'm just going to make sure that we have custom order set. I'm just going to run the game and I'll show you the error that you may get. So here is a common error that occurs when you're trying to run a project that was not designed for 2.3. And how I know that is because you'll get something like this, where it'll say the create event for object is undefined. And then they'll give you some details. Now the reason this happens is because any scripts that are converted don't always get converted correctly in drag and drop. Now it's something that I've logged a job about, so hopefully it gets solved. But you can identify the error by this create event looking for an undefined object. And here's the script that it's referring to. It's called draw coins. So if we just go over to our draw coin script and we look at this and we see that the declare a new function code block has everything been placed under it, except this one didn't get moved. So you just need to drag that and put that there. Now the reason as to why that happens is anyone's guess, but obviously the conversion process doesn't do its job correctly. So if we run that again, we can see there will be another error. There's another script that has a similar problem. And this time it's the player's V move in calc movement. I happen to know that the error is because where we do our resetting of our variables. So in here under reset input, if we go into there, then the same thing has happened. These assigned variables have not been placed under this function. So I'm just going to drag that over. And while we're at it, if we open up draw score, there is the same thing that's happened. So this draw value has not been placed here. So now when we run the game, we'll find those errors have been corrected and our game works as normal. So with that out of the way, I'm just going to set it up so that we can use the one-way platforms in our game. So if we go into our sprites and then look at our solid here, I'm going to duplicate that with Control D and I'm going to call this solid underscore one way, standing for one way platform. And I want to change this to a blue color. So I'm just going to edit that and just change it to a low alpha value color. I'm going to Control A and delete that and then press F for the fill tool and we'll just fill that in. Now close this down and we'll leave that as is. Now we need an object to represent the sprite in the room. So right click on objects, go to create object. And we're just going to call this O underscore solid underscore one way. And we'll just drag across that sprite onto the object. So we can close that down. And if we have a look at our objects, we have a solid and a solid one way. Now, because I want to refer to either one of these, I want to create a parent object. So right click, go to create object and call it O solid PAR. And we want to drag these two into the child section down here. So now whenever I refer to O solid PAR, I'm referring to these objects as well. So any collision checks or things such as that will actually run against both of these. Now that also means that any reference to OSolid should be replaced with OSolid PAR. Now Gamemaker has a search and replace. If you do a Control Shift F, you can go and replace text, but it doesn't work for drag and drop. So we can use it to find where OSolid is, but you can't do a replace. It won't actually work. It'll replace the code, but not the actual code blocks. So don't use that at the moment. Hopefully Yoyo Games will fix that bug in a future patch. So because I don't know if it's been fixed when you're watching this video, I just suggest you do it in the manual way. Go down here, double click, and wherever you find a reference to OSolid, we want to replace that with OSolid PAR. So take a copy of that. And here as well, when we're checking the ground, and in our collision check here. Now I'm just going to make this bigger. And for our collision check down here, we want to change it. Now this one is actually the collision check for the HSP, for the horizontal movement. So I'm actually not going to change the horizontal movement. We don't actually need to do anything with our horizontal collision check in relation to one-way platforms. So make sure you don't change it in there. But we'll find that there are a few more. So down here, there's one, and that should be all. And yeah, that's that one there. So they've all been changed. Now let's go and have a look at our room, and let's make sure that we have room 1 as the next room to run. And let's go into room 1. And for this, I'm going to get rid of the enemies for the moment. Just move those over here. And I want to expose the collisions. I want to add some collisions here that we can use to test. So I'm going to take this one, copy and paste that, and just make it a little bit bigger over here. And just put a section here that we can use to maybe jump up and down and just make sure that it's working for us. And we'll take one more and just place that here. Now this section here, I want to change and use new one-way platforms. So I'm going to drag that smaller, take in one of these, and we'll add that. So now here at least, we should be able to test if we can jump up through this platform. Now in order to have this work, we need to look at our collision script. And the first thing we'll need to do is set up our vertical collisions. I'll just press F12 and just hide the sides there. Now the first thing I want to do is ensure when we look for a collision, we are looking at least 1 pixel ahead. Our global.grav value increments our VSP in decimals. And that's not enough to trigger our collision checks. So the first thing I want to do is set the value for when we're checking to be a minimum of 1 or -1, depending if we are moving down or up respectively. So if we just go up to just before we're doing our vertical check, let's add another check here. And this time we're going to look at our VSP first, and we want to see if that is greater than 0. And if it is, let's declare a temporary variable. I'm going to call it underscore VSP. And here I'm going to set it to the max of 1 or VSP. And what that means is if VSP is greater than 0, we're either going to use VSP or we're going to use 1. And all it's doing is saying that if VSP is ever between 0 and 1, we're not going to use that. We will just use 1 because we're using the maximum out of these two. And we know that VSP is always greater than 0 when this runs. So if it's not greater than 0, I'm going to put an else in here. And we'll do another check and say if VSP is less than 0, then this time we'll set our underscore VSP to be a minimum of -1 or VSP. Now, this time it's a minimum because VSP is a negative number, so it's always less than 0. But if it's between 0 and -1, we just want to use -1. And that will ensure we're not checking for a collision at those fractional values between -1 and 1. And by doing that, it just enables our on-ground to work better. If we didn't do that, you would see that while VSP is less than 1, you would get on-ground not triggering and your player would appear to be in the air for 3 steps while the gravity is applied and VSP is greater than 1. So the other condition here, put an else in, and if it is neither of these, then that means that underscore VSP is just equal to 0. So now that we have this new underscore VSP that we're using to check our vertical collisions, we can use that here to make sure that we're applying that when we look for a solid. Now, before we do this, because this is going to just be our solid collisions, I'm going to also just change that to just be OSolid, because we're not going to check for the one-way platforms with that code. But we're going to look at that a little later. Before we touch on that, I want to address the one-way platform code, because I'm going to put separate code for when we're falling down for checking one-way platforms. And the reason is when we're moving up, we don't want to do anything with one-way platforms. So we essentially want to ignore them when we're moving up. And for that reason, I'm going to declare a temporary variable just here. And I'm going to call it underscore falling. And falling will be true if the player is falling down and false if we're moving up. So we can just set that to underscore VSP is greater than 0. So we can use a condition here, and when VSP is greater than 0, falling will be true. When it's not, falling will be false. Now let's use that to say that if our falling is equal to true, then we want to process our one-way platforms. So I'm going to call it OWP, one-way platform. Now, if we are falling, I'm going to grab an object at place. And if we're falling, we want to have a look at our one-way platform. And I'm going to look at it at our current X and our underscore VSP. So we're looking at where we're falling. And I want to return a list of the instances that we collide with. And I'm going to store it in a temporary variable called list. So let's put a comment here. And this is to get a list of the one-way platforms we are colliding with. So object at place can return the ID of a platform that you collide with, but it can also return a list of them if there's more than one. Because if there's more than one that you're colliding with and you don't return the list, it'll just return a random one of those, and we won't be able to tell if we're actually falling onto a one-way platform or if we're actually in contact with a one-way platform now. So if we just go look at our level and then just bring our player in, if I take a copy of this and we'll place another one just here. So with the player, if I'm in contact with a one-way platform and I'm falling down, we want to know if we're going to be in contact with this platform in this step. And if we are, we want to stop the player. So that's why we're looking at where we are currently plus our VSP. So say if our VSP puts us down to there, we need to get a list of these two platforms we're colliding with. And the one we're interested in is the one that has the highest Y value, the lowest platform. Remember, Y starts at 0 and gets bigger as we go down. So this platform is the one we want to get. It has the highest Y value. And that's the one that the player needs to collide with and move against. This one, essentially, we can ignore. So we need to go through the list and just grab the ID of the platform with the highest Y value. Now, if the player is coming down on a platform and they're not making contact with another one, well, the same thing happens. We just look at our list, we grab the highest Y, which will be this one, and then we make contact with it. So it works whether we're touching a platform or not. And you may find that some tutorials showing you how to do one-way platforms won't address this issue. And the issue is that you're making contact with a one-way platform while you're trying to land on one. And that's why this one's a little bit more complex, because we're catering for that, enabling you to essentially stack these on top of each other, and the player will be able to stop at this one, like so, and detect that as a platform, because we're going to grab the one with the highest Y. So let's leave this here and we'll test it. And I'll actually take a copy of that and I'll paste that here and we'll test that as well. Make sure all of that works. So I'll just delete the player there. Let's go back here. And now let's work out how we can look at this list and grab the ID of the platform with the highest Y value. So we're going to use the list functions. And the first thing I want to do is use the get list item at. Now a list is exactly what it sounds like. It's a list of the IDs that we found in this collision. So we're going to look at the list called _list. We're going to get the index 0, which means the first entry in the list. And I'm going to store it in a temporary variable called _lowest _ID. So even though we're looking at the highest Y value, we're actually looking at the ID that is the lowest. So a platform that is the lowest on the screen. So essentially I'm setting the first one to be our lowest. And then what we'll do is we'll look at the rest of the items in the list and see if there's any more, and we'll compare them to this one. And if that one is lower, it will become the lowest ID. So the next thing we want to do is get how many items are in our list. So we have a list count here, and we want to look at _list, and I'm going to store it in a variable called _num, and that can be a temporary. So that'll retrieve how many items were in our list. And let's have an if here, and let's look at that and say, if num is greater than 1, because we already set the first one to be the lowest here. So if we have more than just one item, what we need to do is loop through them and compare them to this one. So let's make some comments here so we know what we're doing. Here we are getting the first ID from the list. Right here, we're going to get how many IDs are in the list. And here we're saying if there are more than one collisions, then get the one-way platform that has the highest Y, i.e. the lowest platform on the screen. So just adding a little description so it's clear what we're doing at each step. Now what we want to do is grab our for loop, because we want to loop through all of the items in the list and compare them. Now a for loop can be used to run through some code a certain number of times. So I'm going to start out by setting I to be 0, and that's just a temporary variable. And how many times do we want to run through the loop? Well, we need to make sure that we run through it up to num times. So how many numbers we found in the count. So if we return 2 for our list here, we will run through this 2 times. But the problem with that is we already ran through it once because we grabbed the first one here. And we know there's more than one number, so we can actually just start this at 1, and that'll skip checking that first entry. Because essentially what we'll be doing is we're comparing itself to itself. We don't need to do that. So if we're running through the loop, we need to get the item for the next one. So we need another get list item at, and we want to get _list. And this time, instead of index 0, we're getting index I. And that's because I is being set to 1 here and then incremented. So if we grab I, essentially we're grabbing not index 0 from the list, but index 1. And I'm going to store it in a temporary variable called _inst. So standing for instance, and we'll store that in that temporary variable. So now that we have this instance, we need to do a comparison. And we need to say, does the instances.y, so we're accessing that variable directly, is that greater than our lowest IDs.y? So is this platform's Y greater than the one we've already stored? And if it is, then we want to go to assign variable, and we want to assign lowest ID to be the new inst. So if this instance was the lowest one, we now assign it to our lowest ID. So now when we have a look, we see that we're checking for a platform, we're getting the ID of it, and if there's more than one, we're actually looping through and grabbing the ID of the lowest one. Now, one problem that might be happening is if we put the player back, we could be here. This is one platform, this is another. We could be falling through a platform and something is not below us. We don't want to land in this case. We don't want the player to stop. So this lowest platform, if we're currently making contact with it, we want to ignore it. We only want to collide with it if we're going to make contact with it this step. through our VSP. So for that reason, right here, where after we've checked, we can also then check and we'll say if lowest ID, if we are not in a collision with it at the moment, then we can process the collision and make the player stop. And to do that, I'm going to use the same code that we've used down here, which we've used previously to enable the player to stop on a solid. So I'm going to move through it fairly quickly because this is something we have done before. What we do is we assign our variable to be called collide and we set it to false. And then we add our while loop. And we say while collide is equal to false, we can do our collision check and we check for a collision with our lowest ID. And we're going to look at our current 0 and our current Y plus 1. Because we're moving down, we know that we can add 1 to our Y. Eventually, we will collide with that platform because we tested up here and said that our VSP is moving us into that platform. And we know that our VSP is greater than 0. So let's do that. And let's check that that is not a collision. And if it's not a collision, let's just add 1 to our Y because it was safe to do so. But if it is a collision, let's put our else in here. And let's then say that we did collide. So our collide is equal to true. And by doing that, that will then take us out of the loop. And the other thing we need to do is our bounce check. If you remember down here, we have a check for how to bounce. And that's because that will enable the coins to bounce. So we need that added as well. But because I want to add it down here, and I'm going to add it for the one-way platforms because we want coins to be able to bounce on solid and one-way platforms, I'm going to add this into a little script. So let's take that and that and that and that. And I'm going to cut that out. Go over here and go to our scripts. Let's make a new script and I'm just going to call it process bounce. And let's paste that in. Now remember, you've got to drag that under here. Now we can go back to our collision. And right here, we can go and execute that script and we'll find our process bounce. And not only do we want it there, I'm going to take a copy of that and then we'll paste it just here. So that'll set our VSP to 0 and let us bounce on a one-way platform if our bounce variable is greater than 0. So that's the code for our one-way platform. Let's press F5 and test that out. So you'll notice something strange that's happening, and that's that I'm stuck in that animation. And the reason that is because our on ground script is not being set correctly. So let's go and look at our check ground. So our on ground variable, it's just not being set correctly. So what I want to do is actually remove the use of this check ground script, and I'm going to set the variable in the collision script instead. Now you could go and delete everywhere that you have check ground, and that'll work fine. But for now, to make the tutorial quicker, I'm just going to take the exit and drag it just there so that when this script runs, it just exits straight away. But you can go remove the check ground because we don't need it anymore. We can go to collision and we can set it here. And by that, I mean, let's set a variable. Let's set our on ground to be false. So right before we do our falling check, we'll just set on ground to be false. And then if we go down and we go down, okay, we can have a look here and say that if we're in this condition, if we're down here in this loop, it means we found some ground below us. So let's just set our on ground here to be true because we know that we're on the ground right there. And as well as that, because that will cater for the one-way platforms, I'll take a copy of that. And further down here, when we run into the solids, we can set it as well. But I want to do a check here because we could be falling down to a solid, or we could be jumping up and hitting our head on a solid. So if I have on ground set to be true here, it'll trigger on ground when we're hitting our head. So we need to check here, and we need to say if falling is equal to true, then on ground is set to true. So with our collision for solids down here, remember this is just solid collisions only. We want to make sure that we're colliding with just a solid. So I can take this away because we don't want to have anything to do with one-way platforms down here. This is just solid collision only. And as well as that, we should change that to an underscore VSP because that's what we need to look at. So same for here. We want to make sure we're looking at our underscore VSP. Great. Let's press play and test that out. So now we have the right animation. When we fall, we change to on ground correctly, and we can jump on these one-way platforms, and we can jump through them and land on them. And when you have a platform on a platform like we have here, that works perfectly. So that's looking great. Let's have a look, and I'll just go to the top and show you everything we have because it is a little bit complicated to get that working. Now I'm going to close the horizontal collisions. So this is our horizontal collisions. And I'm just going to close that because none of that changed. We are still colliding with those solid. We didn't make any changes there. So here what we're doing is ensure a minimum for VSP checks. And by that, we mean that we're ensuring that if we're falling down, we're looking at 1. If we're going up, we're looking at -1. Otherwise, we know our VSP is just 0. So after we do that, we then get a variable called falling, and we check that we're falling. We set our on ground to false, and then we process our one-way platforms here. So once we've checked if we're falling, then we're interested in looking at one-way platforms. We get a list of the one-way platforms we're colliding with. We store it in the variable list. We then get the first one. We say that's our lowest one that we're colliding with. We get a list of how many, and if there are more than one, then we check each one, and we get the one that has the highest value for Y, and we call that the lowest ID because in relation to the screen, it's the lowest platform. So then what we do is we make sure that we're not in contact with that platform, and if we're not, we set our collide to be false, and we run through our standard collision system like we use for the solids, where we look at that platform and we move down onto it if we can, and when we can't, we set our VSP to 0. Now that's our one-way platform code. Then our solid collisions are separate, but they are the same thing that we had before, except now we're making sure that we're looking at underscore VSP, and we're doing our checks against the sign of underscore VSP, and we're moving the sign of underscore VSP. And once we have a collision, we set our collide to be true, processing our bounces, and if we are falling, we're setting our on ground to be true. And remember, VSP is being set to 0 in here. And then lastly, we're assigning that VSP to Y. Now that's quite a complex tutorial on how to do one-way platforms, but I think it's the easiest way that you can do it in drag and drop. I've gone through numerous iterations of finding the easiest method to show you, and I really believe that that method is the cleanest and easiest way that you can do it. The other thing you'll notice is that this tutorial is the first of its kind. There are no other one-way platform tutorials for drag and drop that do what this tutorial does. Allowing you to stand on a platform while you're in contact with another platform is something that's quite complex, and it's the reason why you won't even find on Yoyo's official tutorials anything about one-way platforms for drag and drop when you're doing a platform tutorial. So this type of code has taken me up to a week to develop and to get ready on a video for you guys. So if you appreciate the time that I put into these tutorials, please click the like and subscribe, and let me know what else you'd like to see for drag and drop. Even though this is the last video in the series for our platformer, I'm going to place a few extra bonus tutorials over on Patreon, just cleaning up a few areas that I believe would help your game a lot if you've been following along. Patreon is a site where you can show support for the channel, and if you're a Patreon member, you get access to bonus features. But even if you're not a Patreon member, you can check out some of the posts over there as I give out helpful hints on Gamemaker. I've also included a post over there which shows you how to set up your enemies so they don't fall off the edge of platforms. There's also another post showing how to mute your sound, so check that out if that's something you want to add to your game. If you're finding that you're having errors in the code here and want to download the project, it is available over on the Patreon site to Patreon members. If you're excited that I've developed a world first one-way platform tutorial for drag and drop, if that amazes you and you want to show some support, then you can do it over on the site. But if that's not possible, that's fine. I'm happy to have you here anyway, and I'd just appreciate if you liked and subscribed the video. Talking of Patreon, I'd like to thank these legendary Patreon members who helped make this video possible. Kaiser Ho and Andy K. Thanks as well to these epic supporters too. Sky Devil Palm, Salvatore Capolino, Dan Half, Gresner, Edward Lyko, Logan Animation 69, Paul R. LeBlanc, David Stylander, Nathan Maybe, and Zach Stofko. And lastly, thank you to these rare supporters too. And the last thing I wanted to mention was about my Gamemaker 2 course on making a tile-based platformer in GML. It's one of the highest rated Gamemaker courses ever on Udemy, and it offers a money-back guarantee, which means after 30 days, if you're not happy, you can get your money back. You can use a code in the description to get almost 90% off, and if it's not to your liking, Udemy will just refund your purchase. So check that out if you want to extend your Gamemaker skills. For now, this is the last episode in this series, so keep an eye out for new content on the channel by clicking the subscribe button and the bell icon, and leave a comment showing me what else you'd like to make in drag and drop. So thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you in the next one.